From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And featured today during our first half hour, K-State's A.J. Tarpoff. He'll be in to address heat stress abatement in cattle, as recent conditions have triggered that problem in this region. What intervention steps can be taken in as far as handling and feeding cattle, adjusting rations to lower the level of self-generated heat in the herd, providing shade, bedding, water sprinkling to penned cattle, and assuring that cattle have full access to adequate and clean water. AJ will cover all that and more next. On this week's horticulture segment, then, K-State's Jason Graves will talk about landscape plant selection for attracting bees and other pollinators. That and more straight ahead on Agriculture Today. Welcome once again to Agriculture Today, our Thursday edition. Glad to have you along with us. Well, that didn't take long. Our transition from spring to summer in Kansas, we've had sweltering heat in the last few days around the state, and it brings to mind, of course, how this is affecting our cattle herds across Kansas. So we brought by A.J. Tarpoff, beef veterinarian, K-State Research and Extension, to canvass this topic of heat stress abatement for cattle. And this is a subject, A.J., that we address virtually every year, but because of its significance, it deserves another look.
It really does. This is the time of year, just like you mentioned. It's almost like clockwork. Middle of June, we get our first big heat wave that comes through Kansas and the Central Plains. This year's no exception. We've got high temperatures, we have cattle out on pastures, we have them in feedlots, we have heat stress. What are the impacts? Why do we pay such close attention to this? It's been documented that the U.S. cattle industry can lose up to $370 million every single year just due to the impacts of heat stress. And that's for a lot of different reasons. I mean, it's, yes, the decrease in performance, the decrease in efficiency, the increase in maintenance energy to try to stay cool, but also decreases in fertility for our cows out on pasture. Also, the potential of a very severe heat and actually having a mortality or some key losses in some of those animals. So the losses are tangible.
It adds up rapidly, and preparing for that stress, that's part of what we'll get into today. But that would start with knowing what the stress level is, and there are standards to go by there.
There are. So how do we measure heat stress? Cattle are a robust animal. They handle heat, they handle cold much differently than what we do. They have a wide range of comfort zones, and it's called thermoneutral zone. For cattle, they're actually do a little bit better when it's cooler, okay? Their kind of peak thermal heat load, where they start actually having some heat issues, can actually be in the 70-degree mark area. So mid-70s, they can actually start displaying some warmer than that. They can start displaying some heat load. So how do we measure it? How do we forecast it? How do we look and try to plan ahead for some of these heat stress events? And there are some really nice tools that are available that take in the key indicators of heat accumulation in cattle, and that's temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. All of those put together gives us a very good picture on how the heat actually impacts our animals.
And those are tracked regularly at various venues.
And there are. These tools are upgrades from our old traditional temperature humidity index. I'm sure many of the listeners have seen or heard about the THI, seen the charts where it has all the different colors, and you can see, okay, well, if the temperature is this, the humidity is this is where my animals are. While that's a very nice pinpoint ability to be able to figure out what it is and gives a good representation, we've got some better tools available. The first is the forecasting tool from U.S. Mark. The U.S. Meat Animal Research Center out of Clay Center, Nebraska, actually has a heat load forecasting tool for livestock. And it actually gives a 7-day outlook to figure out, okay, what days in particular might some heat stress events be coming. So that's a nice forecast where we can actually, plan ahead 2 or 3 days from now. We're going to have X many days that are going to be, might have some problems. So that's a tremendous tool to plan ahead. Another great tool that is very Kansas specific is the Kansas Mesonet. The Kansas mesonet, I'm sure many operations that use the mesonet for different areas of agriculture, like farming and moisture levels and you name it, temperature. But there's actually an animal comfort index. And that animal comfort index uses the same indices of temperature, humidity, wind speed, solar radiation, all of those critical pieces, but gives you an hourly update on what those animals are hearing. There's also 65 locations and readers all over the state. So you get an individualized local outlook on what is happening currently. I routinely use the Kansas Mesonet Animal Comfort Index for monitoring nighttime cooling. Yep. Since it runs on an hourly basis, 24/7, you can actually track and see how much nighttime cooling hours we will get during the night.
And that's pivotal when it comes to heat abatement.
It really is. So that's where cattle dissipate heat, and they really need, about 6 hours during a nighttime cooling to dissipate their heat load they accumulated during the day. If they don't, the cattle, they don't start off on thermoneutral. They don't start off at zero. They're already in a stressed environment, and that's where we continue to add on heat load for multiple days through heat load events. And so the biggest risk is day 2 or 3 into some of these severe heat waves where we really see impacts on our cattle.
You can truly look ahead with some efficiency here by using these tools. You can go to the Meat Animal Research Center USDA's website or the mesonet.ksu.edu website, or both, to look into expected heat stress on your cattle herds in the coming days. And just for the record here, AJ, before going any further, we have had in recent days enough daytime heat, not pushing triple digits necessarily, but the right combination of warm weather and the other elements to create stress.
We absolutely do. I checked the mesonet, and here in Manhattan, Kansas, we are in animal comfort index where we are in severe. So we are having severe heat stress even currently. While we might be in the low 90s, we have increased solar radiation, we have high humidity and low wind speeds. All of this, we can feel it when we step outside. If it's sticky, we don't have the breeze, we feel the heat, we feel the sun. All of those contribute to heat loads and heat stress events.
So you started into this, let's add more to it, how individual animals, individual cattle dissipate that heat and what has to happen for that to occur.
Absolutely. So first of all, I think it's important to note that not all animals are impacted by heat the same. Okay, even animals within the same herd that have a similar genetic background, hair coat, hair color, previous health insults, or if they're battling some type of respiratory disease currently, and also the amount of fat cover. Some of our finished animals at feedlots, they're getting close to market. All of these animals would be more susceptible to heat stress. So typically our darker heighted animals, our heavier weight animals, or very young animals, or infirmed. So if they're sick, if they're battling some type of illness, anything that has added stressors, those animals are at increased risk. Now, obviously, once the temperature gets above those critical levels, cattle start to accumulate heat, but how do they dissipate it? And there's a lot of discussion about that, and this also goes into what we see whenever we check our cattle. And what we see is panting. We see increased respiratory rate. We see animals change their behavior where if they're out in pasture, they're down in a low-lying area in some shade, or they're standing in a pond. So we see a change in behavior. We see panting. We see increased respiratory rate. Why do they breathe heavier? Why do they pant like a dog whenever they get hot? And it really comes down with how cattle dissipate heat. Some people say cattle don't sweat, and that's not technically true. They do sweat, but it's very inefficient. So cattle only have the ability to sweat about 10% as much as what people do. So pretty inefficient, so they still sweat and they can dissipate some heat that way. But the most important way that they dissipate heat is by panting. So evaporative cooling through the respiratory tract, they're able to take some of that heat from the inside of the body and dissipate it out through breathing. That's why they increase their respiratory rate. That's why they pant. They're just trying to blow off heat.
But can that respiration keep up with the buildup?
Yeah, and typically not. They in normal cattle, healthy animals, you name it, they routinely build up heat loads. I've seen normal, happy, healthy animals that are bouncing around playing, run them through the chute and actually get a true temperature on these animals, and they can be elevated temperature by 3 or 4 degrees that you would think that they have a severe fever. It was just accumulative heat load from the day before. Okay, so cattle can really handle that elevated temperature. However, there's always that critical threshold, and some of those animals can be really impacted by those increase in temperatures. And that's where we really need nighttime cooling. So it does take about 6 hours of nighttime cooling to blow off the heat that they've accumulated during the day. That is what's critical every single day during these heat load events, is we need nighttime cooling. The other thing to keep in mind is, when do cattle peak their internal temperature during a heat stress or heat load area? So the peak internal temperature of cattle peaks about 2 hours after the external peak. So right now, during this time of year, we are getting peak temperatures in the late afternoon, early evening. Well, whenever that peak is and it starts to cool off, once the sun starts to go down, it's 2 hours after that cattle finally stop accumulating heat and start cooling down. So those are good references, as they need 6 hours of cooling. Their hottest that they're going to be is in that early evening hours, 2 hours after the peak external temperature. Some good rules of thumb to work off of is, if you've had 2 consecutive days of severe heat stress with no nighttime cooling, okay, if you've had 2 days already, the third day is going to be really critical.
The next thing is, what can cattle managers do to help those cattle along in that heat dissipation? And there are management steps aplenty to talk over, which we will do, AJ, after the break, if you'd stand by.
Absolutely.
Along with this, to cover means of contending with heat stress in cattle herds as we're into those seemingly dog days of summer a bit early this year, AJ Tarpoff, beef veterinarian, K-State Research and Extension, and he'll be back with us, Mike Side. After you hear this, this is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Resuming now on Agriculture Today, our visit with K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff, as we're into the topic of reducing heat stress in cattle, as we've had quite warm and humid days settle into Kansas of late, and we can expect more of that to come, of course, as the summer rolls on. So stress is occurring. That's understood, AJ. What can the cattle manager do to counteract that, and where would you start?
I think the first thing, kind of the easiest in some circumstances, is we need to be careful when we handle these animals, especially if we're at a confined operation, if we're at a feedlot, a backgrounding operation. Yes, we have to process them. Yes, we have to move them. We may have to weight sort them. There's a lot of different things we might have to do. If we do have to do some of that management, try to have it all completed by 10 a.m. And the reason for that is handling them, moving them through a facility, all of that increases heat load, increases that exercise heat that gets developed as those animals are moving. We really want them to be stress-free out, in their home pen, trying to dissipate heat as best of their ability. So if we can wrap that up by the early morning hours and then let them rest the rest of the day, that would be ideal. Number 2 would be feeding. And feeding is often brought up because that is also one of the ways that cattle actually increase temperature. It's called the heat of digestion. Mm-hmm. When cattle consume feed, think of their digestive tract, their rumen, as a massive heat vat. Due to the fermentation process, it actually produces heat during the digestion process. So how long does that take? What does that kind of look like? Well, when we feed cattle, they will actually increase their heat load just from digestion for the next 4 to 6 hours. So kind of the peak heat of digestion is, 4 to 6 hours after we fed them. We can kind of use that to our advantage. Some operations might implement some changes in feeding times, where we can actually feed the heavier amount of our ration in the later afternoon, evening hours to be able to push that increase in heat of digestion during the nighttime cooling hours. So we don't have cumulative heat during the day. We are modifying the heat of digestion to actually occur during the nighttime cooling. So that is one thing that's often been implemented, where we can just kind of split those rations, split those feedings to start feeding later in the evening.
What about the composition of the ration? That would certainly make a difference here, would it not?
Composition is really critical. So one thing to keep in mind is not all of our feed components are equal when it comes to production of heat during digestion. So the heat of digestion The lower quality that it is, the harder it is to digest, the more heat that it takes to actually help that digestion process. So low quality forages, straw, things like that are pretty hard to digest inside the rumen, those actually produce more heat load from digestion than some of our other feedstuffs. So, rapidly green growing grass, thankfully it's readily digestible. Grains, feedlot rations, silages that are very, easily digested through the rumen. Those don't produce near as much, actual heat during digestion. So they're, we might be able to modify the ration components to have more readily digestible nutrients. So we actually don't produce as much heat during that digestion process.
One would think sensibly that the more bunched up cattle are, the more accumulated heat in that given area, exacerbating the problem. Is that the case?
It really is. The more animal units we have in a specified area, the more heat there is in that specific area. So some other really easy things that we can do if we have the space, and this all comes down to management, is potentially we can split pens. We can reduce stocking density. When we reduce stocking density, there are less animals producing heat per general area, right? Another thing that it does is gives them more areas to rest, increases their water tank capacity. There's actually more water availability per animal within that group. So splitting pens, being able to reduce stocking rates, obviously is great for feedlot pens if we have the pen capacity, but that's not always practical in a lot of situations depending on the operation.
Associated with that then would be assuring that there is some level of air circulation to provide a measure of cooling down, if nothing else.
With evaporative cooling, breezes and light breeze, a light wind is really critical to help cool these animals during the heat of the day and through the nighttime cooling hours. So mounds, you'll drive past an operation, there'll be dirt mounds in the middle of pens, and cattle will crawl up to the top, and they can actually catch a breeze about 10 feet off the ground. There's a slight breeze that kind of floats through some of our feeding operations. Cattle can sense that, and they actually go up to take advantage of that. So mounds and pens to be able to pick up some of those higher breezes, but also making sure that management-wise, we're not impeding breezes going through our operation. Clipping weeds on fence lines, making sure that we have anything like that knocked down. Making sure that we don't have heavy equipment that's parked in the way actually blocking some of the breeze that could be coming to our animals. So things like that. Hay storage. I see a lot of stacks of hay, big square bales that are yes, it might be very handy during the winter to have some of that windbreak, but during the summer months we want to increase wind speed as much as we can just to be able to dissipate some of that heat load.
And in the confinement setting as well, giving those cattle some place to rest while not building up heat is important here too. And bedding can contribute to that, you say.
It really can. So keep in mind a dirt floor pen can get up to in the 140 degree, mid 140s Fahrenheit temperature. And that's the true temperature of the pen floor. Cattle will not choose to lay down and rest whenever the pen floor is at that temperature. So what do we do about it? Well, there are ways that we can modify the environment to help cool the environment to increase the comfort for our animals. And it's kind of threefold. Number one, something simple as, when it gets really hot, what about putting bedding down? Something along those lines. Something as simple as some straw bedding on the pen floor can decrease that pen floor temperature by 25 degrees. So I'll say that again, just something like spreading out some straw on a dirt pen floor can decrease that temperature by 25 degrees.
That's a difference maker.
It's a huge difference. The biggest thing to be careful if you're going to implement that strategy is make sure you spread out the straw enough. We don't want cattle laying on top of each other. We want them spread out in a very large area. But yes, something like straw can be helpful in some of these circumstances. Other things that are implemented: shade and sprinklers. Okay, those are the two most commonly utilized to help modify that environment. Shade, it's a wonderful tool to have. Cattle have an immense shade-seeking behavior. It's absolutely amazing. If there's one piece of shade anywhere, they will seek that out and to be able to seek shelter. We see it with our pasture cattle. During the heat of the day, we find them down in the low-lying draws. We find them seeking out that shade. It's no different in a feedlot, that they'll kind of seek that out. They'll be able to get out of the sunlight. The biggest thing is making sure we have enough shade coverage per group of animals. And rough estimates, we usually shoot for about 20 square foot of shade on the pen floor per animal. Okay, so that's kind of what we shoot for, and that's what our goals are for whenever we're putting up some of these structures. Now, shade's great. Again, that's a cost of the operation. That is an investment into the future. The other tool that's heavily utilized is sprinkler systems. And we have to be careful when we use sprinklers, and we need to use them for the right reasons. So sprinklers, we don't wet the cattle to cool them during the heat of the day. That can be disastrous. We can actually increase the humidity at the pen level during the heat of the day if we use sprinklers at the wrong time of day. So our goal of sprinklers is to help evaporative cooling during the nighttime cooling hours. So we actually use the sprinklers in the overnight hours or in the early morning hours. We wet the animals, wet the pen floor. We use big water droplets to make sure that we actually get the water on the pen floor itself and it doesn't just dissipate in the air and cause more humidity. So we really wanted to wet everything so it helps with the evaporative cooling to be able to cool the pen floor, cool the animals before the heat of the day.
Well, AJ, last but by no means least, and this is for confined cattle as well as those out on pasture, drinking water, clean and ample volume.
Absolutely. Water during heat load and heat stress events, water is absolutely critical for our cattle. How much do cattle consume? Okay, and some good rules of thumb that I work off of is once we get into the summer months, cattle their needs are about 5 times the amount of dry matter they're consuming. So however many pounds of feed that they're consuming dry matter, it's 5 times that amount in water weight that they actually need to consume that day. So it's an enormous amount of water. Some of our finished steers and heifers might be consuming up to 30 gallons of water a day. So it's a lot. To put that into perspective, 5 times dry matter, when the temperature rises from 70 degrees to 90 degrees, it doubles the water consumption needs for those animals.
That's dramatic.
It is a dramatic increase. It's really fascinating about how much they actually need, and we're learning more and more through science as the years go on.
Loads of considerations, AJ, but the point is producers need to be attuning their thoughts in these directions fairly soon now. We've already had several days in a row of these oppressive conditions for cattle. Thanks for going over all of that with us today. Appreciate your time. We will catch up with you once more soon.
Thank you.
AJ Tarpoff, beef veterinarian, K-State Research and Extension. Some of the numerous ins and outs of abating that heat stress in your cattle herds. This is Agriculture Today. Welcome back to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today, our Thursday edition. Eric Atkinson here, and next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, with the Biden administration announcing yesterday that it was working on a proposed change to the navigable waters definition in the Clean Water Act, the head of the nation's largest farm group said the decision to remand the Trump administration's navigable waters protection rule was a blow to agriculture. The Biden EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers said in a news release that the Trump administration rule had led to a degradation in protection of waters. The agencies asked a federal court to remand the Trump rule to allow for what will be the third rewrite in the past 12 years. American Farm Bureau Federation President Zippy Duvall said in a statement late yesterday that his group was extremely disappointed in the decision to move on from the previous rule that he said brought clarity to farmers and ranchers. Duvall went on to say that EPA Administrator Michael Regan had recently recognized the flaws in the 2015 waters of the U.S. rule and had pledged not to return those to the overreaching regulations, in Duvall's words. Now, the EPA filed a motion for the remand of the rule on Wednesday in the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts. That's one of several ongoing legal cases. The Biden administration had until May of this year to conduct a review of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And the USDA has been cautioning the 6 hog slaughter plants affected by the U.S. District Court ruling that they should prepare to revert to their old chain speeds of 1,106 animals per hour by the end of this month. However, USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack told reporters that no decision had been made yet by the Department of Justice on whether to appeal the federal district court ruling that struck down the Trump-era rule allowing unlimited line speeds at certain pork processing facilities. That ruling is set to take effect on June the 29th, with the USDA announcing last month it would enforce the decision. Vilsack explained that the 6 facilities that had been allowed unlimited line speeds under the new swine inspection system will have to decide whether or not they'll want to go back to the 1,106 head per hour line speed, or whether they want to make adjustments in terms of adding additional hours or adding additional workdays to be able to process the same number of animals that they currently process during the course of a day. There's some encouraging numbers now in the USDA's latest update on agricultural trade. Here's a look from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
We now have the complete ag trade numbers for the first 7 months of this fiscal year, October through April, and so far, in dollar terms, ag exports have brought in how much? I say, how much?
$107 billion.
And according to Wide Awake USDA economist Bart Kenner there, that's an increase over the same time frame a year ago of
26%.
Wow, that's big. But Bart, you sound a little tired. Oh, I know why. This is your first week back at work after the birth of your baby boy. So are you all rested up now?
No.
That's what I thought. So let me give some of the numbers for you. That okay?
Yes.
Okay, so far this year, wheat exports up 12%, soybeans 103%, and Bart, how much have corn exports brought in?
$9.9 billion, an increase of 132%.
Wow, he says that for all ag products, we are well on our way to having a record year. So Bart, why don't you now go get some sleep now?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. Gary Crawford with the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The USDA Secretary is encouraging investors of business opportunities now to look at the promising prospects and innovative aspects of the rural economy. USDA's Rod Bain reports.
At the midpoint of the annual Select USA Investment Summit Wednesday, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack made his pitch for business and job investment in rural America.
I believe that there is no better place to invest than in rural America and in businesses that support and are associated with agriculture, renewable energy, and food systems.
Secretary Vilsack points to the farm-to-market involvement of USDA, from supporting ag production to its foreign agricultural service offices across the globe, opening new and expanding existing markets. He also notes rural innovation that he believes will lead to new economic and investment opportunities, such as biofuels and bio-based products and climate-smart agriculture.
There are opportunities in every region of the United States for folks to invest and to become part of something big in food, agriculture, and in climate solutions. Rural America is ready to deliver.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, the Kansas Soybean Update with Greg Akagi.
Kylie March is joining us. She is a recent graduate of Lebec County High School and is also the recipient of the Kansas FFA Oil Crop Proficiency Award. And Kylie, first, congratulations.
Thank you.
What does this work on this award entail?
I drive a combine during harvest, and I run all different types of tillage equipment and bring seed to the field during planting season and help in the office doing bookwork and in the shop doing whatever other work that needs to be done, as well as chemical calculation, scouting fields for pests and other things.
Yeah, because this involves several things about your roles, responsibilities, which you just mentioned, but challenges that you may have had, but also experiences and opportunities in working with this that can impact your future too. What were some of those challenges that you had during this time?
One of the biggest challenges I had was through my high school career was simply time management. I had to balance schoolwork, and I was involved in tennis and FFA and my church that I go to through youth group. And finding the time to balance all of those things along with work on the farm was really hard and challenging, but I made a way for it to work. And that may have been times that I had to take off from school to go spend time on the farm, which maybe wasn't the smartest option, but there was work to be done on the farm. But I made up my schoolwork and got everything caught up, and it all balanced out and worked well.
As you look at that, what's some of the biggest accomplishments or some of the things you look back at that are self-gratifying as far as being able to accomplish what you did?
I spent a lot of time in the combine and spent a lot of time in harvest, and one of the biggest accomplishments was learning how to set the combine properly to make sure we got all the seed in the bin that was possible. And being able to do that made a huge impact on the profit we made.
And Kylie, as go on here, of course, just graduating high school, what's next for you?
I plan to attend Kansas State University in the fall, majoring in agriculture education with a minor in agronomy.
That is Kylie March, who is a recent graduate of Lebec County High School, and she was also the recipient of the Kansas FFA Oil Crop Proficiency Award, which is sponsored by the Kansas Soybean Commission, as she joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
And this is Agriculture Today. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's horticulture segment, and once more, we're previewing one of those sessions that are taking place over the noon hour every other week, sponsored by K-State Research and Extension, the K-State Garden Hour, as it's called. We will hone in on the topic that'll be addressed this coming Wednesday, the 16th. Encouraging pollinators to come to one's landscape and gardening area. And speaking on this will be Jason Graves. Jason is the horticulture agent for the Central Kansas Extension District. Gardening in support of pollinators, and largely talking here about bees, correct, Jason?
Yeah, you're right. Exactly, Eric. Thanks for bringing this topic up. We're looking forward to talking about pollinators and bringing awareness to all the benefits they bring, and certainly we're going to be talking a lot about bees because they are probably our primary pollinator and the one pollinator that most people are familiar with and really want to support. And so we're going to even narrow it down a little bit more and focus a little bit even on native bees, and sometimes that surprises people to find out that we have over 4,000 species of native bees that are operating each and every day in our environment that are pollinating plants and providing all that biodiversity for us that we rely on. So it'd be fun to highlight them and learn more about how to support those native bees.
There are certain native plants that are at least part of the preferred habitat for pollinators like bees, and those you'll be talking up at the webinar?
Yes, exactly. The focus of this webinar is on sort of the habitat resources that these bees need, and we know that bees, just like us, have to have food and shelter, and so those are the things we want to focus on providing them, and we can do that right from our backyard, in any home or garden or landscape. There's a lot of creative ways that people find to support pollinators, so we want to talk about some of those and then highlight plants that are important. We tend to look primarily towards native plants when we talk about pollinators, not exclusively. There are other plants that we utilize, but the native plants tend to be just so adaptable, and they have a lot of history with a lot of our native pollinators, and so they just have natural relationships and really support them well. So we're going to highlight some plants and some ways to utilize those in landscape to support pollinators. By way of example, some native plants that bees prefer. You might cite some of those. Oh, sure. Yeah. No, we, here in Kansas, you can think through the different seasons we have coming through spring to summer to fall. We like to highlight different plants in different seasons, and certainly in our spring season, we can highlight plants from the golden Alexander and the spiderwort, and then we get into the summertime, we may see things blooming like the native bee balms or even the blazing star or the sunflowers, all the way through fall where, we need to still be providing the pollen and nectar and habitat for those bees. We're highlighting plants, people are familiar with, such as asters and goldenrod and some of the common fall plants. But, we're also going to highlight some plants that maybe you haven't heard of before. We're hoping to include a couple other plants, things such as figwort or, maybe even some of the herbs that we use in our vegetable gardens that are really great support for pollinators as well. So we're going to touch a little bit on a lot of plants is the hope here. And one wants to create an assortment of supportive plant material, do they not, within a given landscape? Yeah, and that's really the critical thing when we talk about the things that our pollinators are utilizing to complete their life cycle, specifically the bees. They rely heavily on that pollen and nectar. Of course, they need pollen to reproduce effectively, and so, we want to encourage folks to have a variety of blooming plant material from spring all the way through fall for our pollinators because, some of our native bees are only, active for maybe even a couple weeks at a time as adults. And so, if there's a kind of a dead spot in the landscape that's not blooming for a couple weeks or we don't have flowers out there, sometimes we can lose some of those opportunities to support them. So, yeah, we're going to highlight ways that gardeners can maybe improve or look at their landscape and think through, are they effectively supporting pollinators, and maybe ways they can do that even a little better. And it sounds as if there are things other than plant material selection that will help bees along. They have other needs? Oh, certainly, yeah. And those are the things, we're going to talk in this webinar primarily more about habitat and the plant side of things, but honestly, yeah, there's other considerations that people, as they learn more about pollinators, are going to want to delve into as well, such as the fact that, some of our pollinators need nesting support, so we can provide, and honestly, our plants do that. A lot of our pollinators nest in plant stems, and sometimes that's interesting for people to learn about. And, I think there's other things, even aside from just the plant material, that may be interesting for folks to think through when it comes to supporting pollinators. Lots to learn here, but it takes a conscientious effort on the part of the homeowner, the landscape manager, to attract bees and other important pollinators to a local setting. You'll be talking all of that up at this upcoming webinar. And how may folks participate in it, Jason, and moreover, bring what will likely be their load of questions? Oh, yeah, exactly. No, we love that. Yeah, we'd love to get people participating and just taking seriously the effort to support pollinators and to talk through questions on the K-State Garden Hour. And so folks are interested, just Google K-State Garden Hour. Sometimes the Google search engine is just as easy as anything. And you'll find a quick link to sign up, and we have just a one sign-up link that you'll click and register, and you'll be actually registered for the entire season of K-State Garden Hour. And so we encourage people to get signed up, and you'll get a reminder email and a link. And we'd love to have folks join us. And, even if you can't join in, you can watch the recording later, and that's a neat thing with the Garden Hour. All of those are posted as well. The recordings are posted for people to go back and watch. It's turned out to be a tremendous outlet of information on all manner of lawn and garden and landscape care. Again, the K-State Garden Hour, the next session is set for the noon hour this coming Wednesday, June the 16th, and it will center on attracting pollinators to the home landscape. And Jason, the best of luck with it. Thanks for sharing a few moments with us right here. Oh, certainly. Thanks for having me. He's the horticulture agent for the Central Kansas Extension District. Jason Graves will be presenting that webinar this coming Wednesday. Do check it out. You can simply search, as he says, for K-State Garden Hour. Be part of it. And that is this week's horticulture segment. And our time for today. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.